as we have communicated in our mail, we will start with the webinar for a maximum of 1.5 hours, most likely a bit shorter, so we can have a short break prior to the AGM. And yeah, it's a great pleasure to introduce Richard Velleman for the first AFINet webinar. And I mean, I'm quite sure that most of you know Richard and are familiar with his work. Nevertheless, Richard was, in his first life, he was trained in experimental psychology before he was trained in clinical psychology and obtained his PhD at the University of Exeter. He has an enormous list of publications. I counted more than 230 newspaper articles, books, and book chapters. And he has been involved in the field of addiction and the family for a very long time. So I think must have been somewhere in the 90s, the first studies were conducted. And he was working, he's a professor emeritus at the University of Bath and has also been associated with the National Health Service, Mental Health Services. Yeah, and he's one of the founding fathers of AFINet and of the stress strain coping support model, which he will present to you right now. He's still actively involved in Goa, so this is quite a quite an interesting issue where he's doing research and training for community lay health workers who deliver psychological interventions to people with severe depression and serious alcohol problems. And he's also a member of the scientific committee of the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction. And I'm quite sure there might be a lot of further affiliations he's involved in. But anyway, I do not want to take too long for introducing him, and I would like to hand over to Richard right now. And our plan is that first of all, Richard will have his lecture, and if you have any questions, you can ask them using the comment function. And afterwards, there will be space for a discussion where you can also put your questions in the comment section. And yeah, now I'm very interested to hear what Richard will be talking about. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Gallus. Can I first check, can people see my first slide? Does that people, the one that starts off with, has in the middle in their own right? Gallus, can you see that on the screen?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Can you see me as well?
Yeah.
And okay, so it moves to the other slide. Fine, good, we're ready to go in that case. So firstly, welcome everybody to, as Gallus has said, the first webinar in the new AFINet series of webinars related to family members and others who are affected by somebody else's alcohol or drug or gambling problem. It's a great privilege to give this first webinar, and I shall say something right at the end about some of the future webinars, which we already have planned. We're developing what looks to be a very exciting program about this terribly important issue, and it's this issue that I want to talk about today. I've titled this In Their Own Right, Family Members Affected by Alcohol and Other Drug Misuse or Gambling, because this is a really important topic. I need to say that I'm giving the presentation, but of course these things are never one person jobs. There's a long-standing research and practice group that have been involved in the work that I'm going to talk about. Lots of people, far too many to mention, but I need to say my main collaborators over the years have been Jim Orford and Lorna Templeton, who are both AFINet trustees, and Alex Capello, who was one of the original group of people who worked out the stress, strain, cope and support model and the 5-step method. And then I also, I'll be talking a bit about implementation later, and I especially want to mention the Family Support Network in the Republic of Ireland, who were the first national organisation to adopt the 5-step method as their major intervention for affected family members. So strong mention here for Sadie Grace and Megan O'Leary. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to quickly go over what I mean by affected family members. I'm going to clarify that this is an evidence-based talk, not one based solely on expert opinion, and I shall be talking about quite a bit of evidence throughout this presentation. I want to briefly discuss why we are concerned about affected family members, and I want to look at what affected family members tell us if we ask them about their lives. And then I want to, from all that, show how we have used this to develop what we and other people have found to be a very useful model for understanding how and why affected family members are affected in the ways that they are, and then how we use that to develop the 5-step method and the evidence we have that it is a helpful and useful method for affected family members and for practitioners. So that's what I hope to cover over the next hour or so. So who are affected family members? Well, it's obvious, really, except that lots of people think of affected family members in very small degrees. So they may only think about parents as affected family members, or possibly children when they're still children. But we have a very broad definition of who affected family members are. And they can be mothers and fathers, of course, but they can also be wives and husbands and partners. They can be children, they can be adolescent offspring, they can be adult children, so people who are now grown up and in their own adulthood, but are still affected by the alcohol, drug or gambling problems of other people. They can be siblings, sisters or brothers and so on. And then they can be wider people, aunts, uncles, grandparents, in-laws. Close friends are affected in very similar ways. So we add them in as almost family members, as affected family members. And then in many societies, family and society have a much wider and more important function than they do in some of our higher income countries. And people considered family found a word I'll come back to, which is a New Zealand Maori term, and the Aboriginal groups in Australia often talk about kin in a similar way. So these are people who are from a much wider, more extended family or more extended part of society. These are all affected family members, or AFMs, of people with alcohol or drug or gambling problems. So I said I was going to say that this was an evidence-based talk, and it is. What I'm saying today is based on many, many years of research. It's interesting, Gallus, you said that maybe our research dated back to the 1990s, and I have to say it's much, much older than that. So it predates my involvement. So the research was really started in the late 60s or early 70s by Jim Orford, who was working in London, and he was very interested in the wives of people with serious drinking problems. And then he and I worked on what happened to children of people with serious drinking problems once they grew up to adulthood in the early 1980s. And we came together in the mid-1980s to start to better understand the range of problems that family members from a wide range of different groups experienced. So we've been researching this for 40 or 50 years now, quite a long time. We looked, as I say, Jim started looking at the effect on spouses a very long time ago, and then he and I on children. But when we started looking more widely, we looked into the impact on other family members of having an addicted relative in a wide range of countries. So we've done that with Australian Indigenous people in the Northern Territory in Australia. We've done it in England, of course. We've done it in India, in Iran, in Italy, in Mexico, in Northern Ireland, and so on and so on. And then we've done many years of research into the effectiveness of interventions to help these family members, again in England, in Italy, in Mexico, in Ireland, and so on. And we have gained over the years a lot of clinical working with and running services for such family members in many countries, many such services. So what I'm saying today isn't simply somebody sitting in an armchair and having a think about what might happen to family members when they're affected. it's very much an evidence-based talk. So why are we so concerned about affected family members? Well, it's because we think affected family members both need and deserve help. Most people with alcohol or other drug or gambling problems never seek treatment. And even if they do, most countries have access issues. And even if they then access help, their affected family members are usually excluded. Services and staff in services still mainly use a very individual model in terms of trying to help people with alcohol, drug or gambling problems, and indeed with other mental health issues. And families often don't get much of a look in. And yet, very often, family members are very badly affected. And these family members have had to deal with these often very long-standing problems with no help or support. So this is something that came to our attention. We've tried to understand better what these problems are and how to help these people, because as I say, they need us, deserve help, but they get very little of it. There are a very large number of people who are affected. It's estimated that there are approximately 15 million people with drug use disorders across the world, and perhaps another 75 million people with alcohol use disorders. And then perhaps another 10 million people with gambling disorders can be added. So we're talking about 100 million people at least with problems because of their own use. Now, if you have what I think is an unbelievably cautious estimate of just one family member who's seriously affected in each case, that suggests a minimum of 100 million affected family members worldwide. Now, as I say, that I think is a very cautious estimate, and I would much prefer to go with an estimate of maybe 3 on average people who are affected, who could be one or both parents, they could be spouses, they could be siblings, they could be children, they could be people in the wider family. It's very easy to see how in very many cases, many, many more people than 1 or 2 or 3 will be affected. So depending on what multiplier you use, if you take 100 million people with serious problems because of their own use of gambling or drugs or alcohol, we get to many, many more millions of people who are affected family members. So it's a huge problem. Recent research by one of our collaborators in New Zealand on the impact of drug and other alcohol and other drug use on New Zealanders showed that what I'm talking about is the case even in as far-flung a place as we can get to across the world as New Zealand. Nearly 50% of New Zealanders of 18 to 65 years of age said that they were impacted by the alcohol use of someone who they care about, and 30% of New Zealanders are impacted by the other drug use of people they care about. And of course, that impact differs. So a larger number of 18 to 24-year-olds say they're impacted by the alcohol use of someone else. Maoris say, again, a large number of Maoris say they are impacted more than the non-Maori population. And Pakeha, which is the term for non-Maoris in New Zealand, are probably impacted, say they're impacted the least, but we're still talking about almost 40%, 4 in every 10 people saying they're impacted by the alcohol use of someone they care about. And as you'll see, the figures are very similar for how people saying that they're impacted by drug use as well. So this is across the world, we see, when we do this sort of research, we see very similar impacts. We don't just do surveys, of course. We actually sit down and talk with affected family members. And I'm trying to summarize here what it is they tell us. Well, they tell us that they worry about their relatives. They worry about almost everything about their relative who is drinking too much or taking drugs or gambling too much. They worry about the relative's physical health. They worry that the relative is neglecting him or herself. They worry about their relative's mental health, about their education or their work or their sporting performance and whether it's failing. They worry about financial affairs. They worry about the frequency, the quantity or the form of the addictive behavior. They don't really know how much someone is drinking or how many drugs or what drugs they're taking or how much they're gambling. They worry about the company the relative is keeping. They worry about the legal and criminal issues that are going to arise. So their lives are full of worry. They're worried about almost everything. They worry about the threats to their family. Common threats that they tell us about are the family's finances being depleted, their relationships being spoiled, their family being harmed, people actually themselves being physically harmed, their social life being restricted. They worry about the children in the family and how they're being affected. They worry about domestic and interpersonal violence. They worry about their homes being invaded by either so-called friends of the person who's using alcohol, drugs or gambling, or people who they've got into debt with. And all of these are not just idle worries. All of the family members have told us have actually happened. And they worry about how to cope. They worry about whether they're doing the right thing. Should they be doing something else? What is the right way to cope? Most people come and say, am I doing the right thing? What is the right thing? What should I be doing? We found over our research that most family members use one or more of three main ways of coping. Sometimes family members withdraw from the situation. They try and be independent of the situation. They try and be independent of the person who is using drugs or alcohol or gambling. Sometimes they get very engaged in trying to change it, in standing up to the behavior. Sometimes they just accept it or put up with it. But each way throws up its own coping dilemmas. And many people will try all three of these in different contexts, but they're always asking themselves the same questions. Should I withdraw? Should I stand up to it? Should I accept it? Should I pay for their drugs? But if I don't, what will happen? And so on and so forth. What we know for certain is that there is no right way of coping. We know that every person in every circumstance is going to follow different pathways. I know lots of people over the years I've heard say, this is what family members must do. This is what they should do. If they want to successfully negotiate this really difficult situation they're in, this is what they've got to do. And we don't do that. We think that what is the best thing to do is going to vary and is hugely influenced by many issues. That's why it throws up so many dilemmas for affected family members. And our job is to try and help them work their way through as many of those dilemmas as possible, as opposed to telling them there is a right way and that's the right way thing that they should be doing. As I said, we've got these three main ways of coping, of putting up with it, standing up to it, and withdrawing and gaining independence. And they come from our research, which showed a much larger number of ways of coping. I think when we first started looking at this, we came up with different sorts of ways of coping. And over the years, we put them down to a smaller number, as you can see here, and then again, an even smaller number of these three. But putting up with it means lots of things. It means being resigned or accepting. It might be being sacrificing yourself or your comfort. It might be making compromises. It might be supporting the relative. Withdrawing and gaining independence might mean not worrying at all, might be leaving, might be getting a new life. It might be avoiding the person, trying to escape from the situation. And standing up to it can mean all sorts of things. It can be both supporting the relative, it can be confronting the person, it can be trying to control their use, control the money, control the alcohol coming into the house. It might be resisting or being assertive. There are lots and lots of different ways people have and do try to cope with this situation. So we've tried to simplify it by saying there are these three main ways, because often we find if people can think about these three main ways and think about what it is they're currently doing, they can realize that there might be alternatives to coping. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So all of these problems that I've just been going over, all of these worries and threats and concerns over whether they're doing the right thing, all of these cause family members to experience symptoms, to develop problems. Family members often feel anxious and worried. They often feel helpless or despairing. They often feel low or depressed. They feel guilty or devalued. Often they feel very angry, very resentful. Sometimes they feel hatred for the person who, although they love them, has also caused so many problems for them and the family. Very often they feel very frightened. Often they feel very alone. Often they feel very sad. We often, as well as talking to people, use questionnaires to back up what we're finding from people's accounts when we talk to them. And one of the questionnaires we use is a symptom rating test, which is a very simple measure of how often you feel any of 30 different common symptoms, some physical, some psychological, and you can get people's scores, which are of how bad their physical symptoms are, how bad their psychological symptoms, and then a cumulative, how bad overall their symptoms are. And what you can see on this figure is that the first 5 come from various bits of research that we've done on affected family members. You can see that their scores on the SRT will range from about 25, 26 up to about 33 or 34. The red column comes from research some other people have done using the same scale, and these are psychiatric outpatients. So these are people with psychiatric diagnoses who are currently outpatients and being seen by the psychiatric services as outpatients. And what you can see is that their scores are at the lower end of what these family members that we have recruited and talked about their issues with, that lower end of the scores that these affected family members get. And then the people right at the end are the sort of average scores that control group people get. So it's people, everybody has some things which are psychological, physical, that they have problems with. Nobody is really symptom free, but this just compares the number of symptoms that people who don't have identified problems will often have against people who are already psychiatric outpatients, and against all these different groups that we over the years have asked questions about what their symptoms are. Most of these people have not been diagnosed. They are not in the group of psychiatric outpatients. They are simply affected family members who are at least as badly affected by the symptoms as a group of psychiatric outpatients. It's also the case, and one of the reasons why these affected family members are often not diagnosed and labelled as people having psychiatric problems, is that affected family members are usually ignored. This ignoring can be passive or it can be active. Passively, there's very little talk about affected family members. They're largely invisible. Although affected family members are very badly affected, there's very little practical help to minimise the harm to them, and they are only rarely offered any help or support. The vast majority of services for people with alcohol or drug or gambling problems do not offer anything to family members, or if they do, they might offer to help with setting up a self-help group, or they might give them a bit of what they might call psychoeducation, which is basically giving them a bit of information. But there's very little help and support out there for affected family members. So all that is passive ignoring. Active ignoring is, well, even if their addicted relative does get help, the family members are usually excluded. They might try and go and attend with their relative. They're told that they're not really invited into the session. Very often in residential treatment services, the services insist that the person coming in has absolutely no contact for the first month or the first 6 weeks with their family members, the very people who have been so badly affected. And as well as excluding them from the services, they're certainly not offered help in their own right in many cases. Of course, this is gradually changing, and over the 40 years I've been working in this area, I've seen very significant changes, and there are very good exceptions to what I'm saying, but this generality that they are usually ignored is, I'm afraid, still very true across the world. Many people hold very blaming, pathologizing, critical models or theories over family members. They believe that the person with the drink or the drug or the gambling problem is there because either their problems have been caused by their family members, by the way that they were parented, by their spouses, by how their children are, or at least their problems have been exacerbated by these negative people, these negative family members. People have very negative opinions about lots of people have very negative opinions about affected family members. And then, of course, there is stigma and fear of stigma. Affected family members are often too ashamed to seek help. They're often unable to access support that meets their needs in a confidential setting with practitioners who understand the needs of affected family members. Many affected family members feel they just have to put up with low self-esteem and health concerns that they have from having a person they care about with alcohol or other drug or gambling challenges. From all of this, the group that I mentioned, Jim Alford and Lorna Templeton, Alex Capello and I, put together a relatively simple model for trying to understand the situation of affected family members. This is the stress, strain, coping, support model. And basically what that says that an addictive problem leads to a lot of stress for family members. And that that's at the top. At the bottom, you can see that that leads to family members' ill health. So stress leads to strain. And the amount of strain, amount of ill health that a given amount of stress causes is influenced by, it was two things, but we've added a third one. It's influenced by coping, how they cope with the situation, what they do, how they deal with it. It's influenced by support. What sorts of support do they get from other people? Do they get financial support? Do they get emotional support? Do they get support, practical support? Do they find activities supportive? What types of support do they get? And it's also influenced by how much information they have. The more information they have, the more in control they can start to feel in a situation where they basically don't have very much control. So we developed the stress, strain, coping support model. And then we thought, well, okay, this is a model to help us understand what's going on and why stress leads to strain and how it might be influenced. But that doesn't take us any further in trying to help affected family members. And so we developed a way of helping affected family members, which we call the 5-step method. And I should say this has got nothing to do with the 12-step method. In fact, to be honest, it never struck me that it might have anything to do with the 12-step method until I did some training some years ago where somebody asked me what the relationship was between the 5-step method and the 12-step method. And it struck me that perhaps this word step might have been a bad one. I had to explain that the 5-step method is not 12-step light. In any way. It's not related to the 12-step method at all. It's called the 5-step method for perhaps a stunningly obvious reason. It has 5 steps. These are the 5 steps. The first step is to listen non-judgmentally, to understand the family member's concerns. I'm going to go into some of these a bit later in more detail. The second step is to provide information and empower the family member to realize that they can find out more for themselves, to make them feel much more powerful in the situation by realizing how they can access and get hold of information. The third one is to discuss current ways of coping and what the advantages and disadvantages are about the ways of coping that they currently use, and then to think about how they might change those methods of coping and what would be the advantages and disadvantages of changing the way that they cope. The fourth one is to explore the sources of support they currently have and what their network of family and friends and activities and so on is around them, and to work out whether it's possible for them to get either more support or different support from the people that they care about and who care about them and the activities that they do. And the final step is to review these 4 steps to clarify what changes the family member is making as a result of going through these steps, and to find out what else they need to do and to help them, empower them to take the extra action they need to get the further help or the further information or understanding that they need. So those are the 5 steps in the 5-step method. We've done a lot of research on the 5-step method, and it has a lot of features that I want to just mention here. It's applicable to whatever the relationship is of the family member to the relative with alcohol or other drug or gambling problems. We designed this particularly for adults, but it's being developed by Lorna Templeton and others in Northern Ireland into the Steps to Cope method, which is a way of using the 5-step method with adolescents, and other people are actively looking at how they can use the 5-step method with people younger than that. And it's also being developed to look into a wider range of problems. So again, Lorna has been developing to look particularly at the problems that bereaved affected family members have if the bereavement has come about because of the alcohol or drug use of their relative. So it's applicable to a wide range of relationships. It's applicable in a wide variety of settings. We've tested it out ourselves in primary care, in specialist health care, in NGOs and voluntary organizations, in a very wide range of ways. It's very flexible in its application. Although it has 5 steps, that doesn't mean you have to have 5 meetings. You can meet more often than once per step. So step 1 or step 2 or step 3 might take 2 or 3 meetings if you so desire, or you can concatenate the whole thing and have a much smaller number of meetings if time is very short, either for you or for the affected family member. It's flexible in the number of family members you can have. So often we might do this with, for example, together with 2 parents, or with 1 parent and a sibling, or with a spouse and a sibling. You can do it individually or with a single family, or you can use the 5-step method in a group setting and have a number of affected family members coming together. You can do it, and initially we did it very much face-to-face, but we have trialed it using telephone, using video conferencing, very much now obviously with COVID. Almost all the work has been done use video conferencing. We have a self-help handbook which we use a lot with our affected family members, and we always try and give the affected family member a self-help handbook so that they can work through things at the same time as when we're seeing them. And there are internet and web formats as well. And it can be extended to include joint work with both family members and the relative with alcohol or drug or gambling problems. So it's a very flexible method. I want to say something about the criteria we use. We took the decision that when we train people in the 5-step method, we were also going to accredit them on the basis of a competency assessment. And there are criteria related to each of the 5 steps in practice. The competence in each step is assessed against the criteria for that step. There are basically 5 criteria for each step, and a further set of 5 criteria assessing their general counselling skills. And people need to get to a certain standard before we can accredit them as a 5-step method practitioner. Now, here's a summary of the criteria for step 1. The actual criteria are much more detailed. So in step 1, we expect that the practitioner will allow the family member to describe their situation and tell their story. We expect that the practitioner will help the family member identify all the relevant stresses and how that family member has been affected, and also how other people in the family have been affected. We expect the practitioner to normalise the experience of family members, giving the family member an indication that they're not alone with their experiences, because family members are so often so isolated, they don't realise that other people are experiencing exactly the same things that they are. It's very, very helpful to people to know that they're not alone. And also the criteria for step 1 are to cover appropriately the beginning and ending of the session, because the 5-step method is a semi-structured intervention. We expect certain things to be covered in each step, and we expect there to be a beginning for each step. There's an introduction, and the purpose of the 5-step method is explained, and confidentiality, or in each step, the purpose of each step is explained. We expect confidentiality to be gone through very carefully. We expect risk assessment to be gone through very carefully, and also we want them to cover appropriately the ending of the session, to summarise the main issues that the family member has raised, to reiterate the use of the self-help handbook, to always reiterate issues of safety and risk, and to plan for the next step, as well as practical issues of the date of the next session and what happens if there needs to be emergency contact between the sessions. So all of those things are part of the criteria that we use for step 1, and some of those things at the end, that 5th criterion, are things that we use in every step. We also use a quantitative questionnaire, the short questionnaire for family members affected by addiction, or the SQFMAA, also known as the Family Member Questionnaire. And we get this given to people either before their first session or very early at the beginning of their first session, and where it can be gone through with the practitioner and the family member. And at the end, towards the end of the 5th step, and at 3 months follow-up. And basically, we look at stress, strain, coping and support, not surprisingly. We look at the impact on the family member. We look at the behaviour that the relative with the problem has, which might be worrying, and how much active disturbance there is of the household or of the family member's life. We look at symptoms of strain, as I've mentioned, physical and psychological. We look at different ways of coping, withdrawal coping, accepting coping, engaged coping, and we look at the type of support that people get, both informal and formal, and also negative support as well, because that's one of the things that needs to reduce over the time of our doing the 5-step method. Just to give you a little bit of data here, this is looking at the results we got from our feasibility study, and then when we did a full intervention where we compared delivering the 5-step method using a practitioner versus a brief introductory session and then getting people to work through the self-help handbook on their own. We had beginning and 3-month data for the feasibility study, and we had beginning 3 months and 12 months data for the randomized controlled trial, or the full intervention versus the brief intervention. I've given brief references at the top. There are proper references towards the end of this talk. So when you see it recorded, or if you get it downloaded, you can download some of the references as well. And basically what I want to show, this is symptoms and this is particular forms of coping. And what you can see is in the feasibility study to the right of both of these graphs, there was a significant reduction in symptoms and a significant alteration in coping. And in the full versus the brief intervention, you'll see that there were very little differences in terms of reduction of symptoms and changes in coping between the full intervention and the brief intervention. But for both of them, there were significant reductions in symptoms, both between at the beginning, at the baseline, and at 3 months, and that these were continued, these improvements continued into when we did our 12-month follow-up. Same with changes in coping. We saw significant changes in coping between baseline and 3 months, and then those changes in coping continue to change over the next 9 months. So these were very positive results, although obviously you'll notice that the symptoms levels are still high. The 5-step method is not a panacea. It doesn't change everything for the affected family member. And we never thought that it would, and we don't suggest that it can. What it does do is make people feel a bit more in control of their lives, a bit more hopeful that they can get on with their lives, and that they might be able to make a difference. And that's what we're aiming to do, and that's what these results show that we have been able to do. So, as I say, some findings we found from the 5-step method, where we've evaluated in different places, in different countries and so on. We find a significant and positive change in coping behaviour. We find reductions in both physical and psychological symptoms, and we find a lessening on the affected family member of the impact of the problem. We also found some very significant changes in practitioners. Practitioners' confidence in working with family members raised hugely, and their awareness of the importance of working with family members also changed significantly. What we found was that lots of family members told us that the reason they didn't work with family members is that they really didn't know what to do with them. They realised that family members were often very badly affected, but if they identified them and started to work with them, then they felt they would need to know what to do with them, and they didn't know what to do with them, so the very best thing was to ignore them. What many practitioners have told us is that having the 5-step method not only gives a structure for the family member to work through, but it gives a structure for the practitioner to work with as well, and that's what makes them feel so much more confident. So, what do I want to say about the use of the 5-step method in practice? Well, I want to say that it's being used increasingly widely. One way it's being used is that people, or certain countries or organisations in countries, have developed national schemes. The first of these, as I mentioned right at the beginning, was in the Republic of Ireland. There is an NGO, a nationwide NGO in the Republic of Ireland, the Family Support Network, who exists to offer support and help to affected family members across Ireland. And they came to us some years ago and said that they'd done a review of the literature, and they thought that the five-step method fitted best with their theory, their ethos about how to help affected family members. They would like us to train them and to maybe develop a national scheme with them being lead in Ireland, so that they could train practitioners across Ireland to better help affected family members. It was because of them that we developed the accreditation system, and I must give a big thanks here to my wife, Jill Velleman, who helped us develop the accreditation system and actually at the moment manages that accreditation system for everyone across the world. But we developed the accreditation system and trained them in the Republic of Ireland, and they have now gone on to develop a network of accredited practitioners, accredited assessors, people who listen to the tapes. As we audio record all the sessions with affected family members, obviously with their permission, and assessors listen to those audio recordings and assess using the criteria that I mentioned earlier. And they also have accredited trainers, so people who deliver the five-step method training, having reached the criteria that we, and again with a lot of help from Jill, laid down as to what people needed to do in order to become an accredited trainer in the five-step method. So they have accredited trainers and accredited assessors, and because of that they have now quite a large network of accredited practitioners across the Republic of Ireland. A few years ago, a few years subsequent to that, we were then contacted by the National Alcohol and Drug Training Agency in New Zealand, who said very similar things. They'd done a literature review, they'd looked at the five-step method, it seemed to be the best fit for them, and they wanted us to train them and to help them develop a national scheme. And that's exactly what we've done in New Zealand, and they're well on the way to becoming self-sufficient. Because our model is not that people need to keep coming back to us in AFINet. Our model is that we want very much to give the five-step method away whilst securing and ensuring a high level of competence in practitioners and trainers and assessors, hence the accreditation system. And then more recently, we were approached by the Jelinek Centre in organisation in Holland, who have said exactly the same things, and we're helping them now to develop a nationwide system being run initially by Jelinek across Holland. So that's one model. Countries or national organisations in a country come to us and say, we want to develop the model across our country. Can you help us do that? The second way is that we do individual training for organisations, for individual services. And there have been many such trainings of the five-step method run across services in Australia, Canada, across England, of course, Hong Kong, Ireland, Italy, Mexico, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, and so on and so forth. We're often contacted by people from other countries, from organisations in other countries who basically ask the same thing. And very often we're contacted by practitioners, single practitioners who've heard about the method and they want to learn how to do it. That's much more problematic because we don't run one-off training courses. We only run training courses usually for organisations, but what we try and do is slot individual people in to the training courses being run in Ireland or New Zealand or whatever it is. I should say that the Holland experience has been particularly interesting because, of course, they want to run their scheme in Dutch, not surprisingly, and we've had to develop ways of ensuring quality control, even though we are not fluent in the language that the training and the practitioners are using to help affected family members. So that's been a very interesting challenge, and which we've successfully resolved. But that means that we can now open the possibility of running the five-step method in a much wider variety of countries other than simply English-speaking countries. So, what can I tell you about current practitioner and service experience? Well, I suppose we have extremely positive accounts coming into us very frequently from very many practitioners, both, as I said, about how it provides a clear structure for them to work with and how it seems to help affected family members that they work with a very great deal. So obviously that's extremely positive for us, and obviously extremely positive for both the practitioners and the affected family members. So what are the takeaway messages I want you to go away with? Well, and I've deliberately here used the New Zealand term whānau for the wider family. And the messages that I want you to take away are that family and whānau matter. They know best their relative who has alcohol and other drug or gambling challenges. They know them best. They matter, and services ignore family members at their peril. Practitioners do not know the person who comes into them nearly as well as the family member who has to live with them, and including them in services is a really important component in how you involve and include affected family members. But the second takeaway message is that family and whānau generally need help to develop their own coping and to develop their resilience for what can be a very long journey besides the person with the alcohol or drug or gambling challenges. When supported, family members can be a vital force for positive change and hope. And we think that the 5-step method can be a very effective way of providing that help and support. Family benefit from having people who can provide non-judgmental support. Support from people who will listen and understand the challenges is crucial. We have had a lot of experiences of family members coming to us and saying not only have they had no help, but the few times they have tried to get help, they've had very judgmental ways of being approached, and that's been very negative for them. So when they went for help, what actually they got was the opposite of that. Whereas what we find is that people who can provide non-judgmental support are often very welcomed by family members. Family and the wider whānau need accurate information. They need accurate information about the help available. They need information about the addiction process, about lapse and relapse. They need information about coping and support. They need information about alcohol and other drugs and gambling. What sorts of activities might their relatives be doing? How can they better understand what's happening with them? And they need a lot of information about a range of issues related to their own health and their own needs. And family need to be able to access information and support no matter where they live. That help and information and support needs to be given by people who care and who are very well trained to provide that support and information. But of course, this thing about supporting and helping people no matter where they live has become, in a sense, slightly easier with COVID. It's one of the unlooked for positives about COVID, because we can't deliver face-to-face in many places. That has forced all our services that we work with to think much more radically about how they can provide this help to affected family members. And many of them have gone down the route, some have gone down the route of telephone, and many of them have gone down the route of internet, of video conferencing, Zoom or whatever. And that has then made them realize that their catchment area has suddenly magnified hugely. One of our close colleagues in New Zealand, who had been setting up a service based in Christchurch and was providing a service in the Christchurch locality, has now taken the decision to provide a nationwide service, because there's no difference contacting somebody on a video conference if they live at the north of North Island or the south of South Island. It makes no difference. People don't have to come in anymore. So this idea of being able to use something like the 5-step method to provide access for people to information support no matter where they live has become much more important and much more possible. Okay, I said that I'd have some references towards the end, and I have. Here are just a few. I'm going to show you another page in a moment and mention more about AFINet, and there is a list of a huge range of papers on the stress strain coping support model and the 5-step method on that website. So these are just a few selected ones. An extremely good book by Jim Orford on addiction dilemmas and family experiences in literature and research. The paper that Jim and I and others wrote on addiction in the family for social science and medicine, trying to draw this to a much wider audience, and some various other other references here, which I won't go through. You were welcomed at the beginning into AFINet's first webinar, and let me say a little bit more about AFINet now I'm here, which is the Addiction and the Family International Network. That is our web address, and underneath that is a link, if you were to click onto it, which takes you through the list of 5-step and stress strain coping support publications. So AFINet is very much an international organisation. A few of us who had been working in this area, mainly the people who were working in the UK initially, but immediately getting a wide range of other collaborators from other countries, decided to form AFINet about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's very much aimed at researchers and policymakers and practitioners who are interested in and care about affected family members, improving our knowledge and understanding of them, improving our ways of helping affected family members, and improving our policy responses across different countries and across the world. It's not aimed at the moment at affected family members themselves. It's a website for professionals who want to seek out other professionals, get in touch with other professionals who are equally as interested in this terribly important area. We have now more than 200 such professionals, policymakers, researchers, practitioners from more than 35 countries. I've listed 35 of them here, although the numbers are always growing. We get applications coming in very regularly. We have 9 Asian countries, 4 African countries, 16 European countries, 2 from Australasia and 4 from the Americas. So AFINet is growing. Many of you will be AFINet members who are listening to this podcast, webinar. But some of you may not be AFINet members, and if not, and you are interested in affected family members, and you are a researcher or a practitioner or a policymaker, or you help run services for affected family members, please do join this community of people who are all seeking to better understand and better help affected family members. And finally, I want to say something about future webinars. So this is the first. We're developing a program. We've got the December one, and we've now got January, February and March already booked in, although we haven't got the precise dates yet for January, February and March. The next one is on the 1st of December, and that's going to be given by Ronaldo Luiz Rizetto from Brazil. It's probably going to be delivered in Portuguese, which is why I put the title up in Portuguese, but it will be a current overview and impact of drugs on the family in Brazil, and we are seeking to also get it simultaneously translated. If we do that, obviously that will open it not just to people who speak Portuguese, although we will be advertising it quite widely across the Portuguese-speaking world, and there are quite a few countries in that Portuguese-speaking world. But if we can get it simultaneously translated, then that will be even better for those people who don't speak Portuguese. In mid-January, we have the chairperson of AFINet Trustees, Dr. Gallus Bischoff, who's going to be talking about a systematic review on the efficacy of interventions for affected family members, and the results of a systematic review project that he and colleagues have been running. I'm not 100% certain whether that's going to be in English or German. We've yet to decide that. But again, we might be able to simultaneously translate it. In February, we have Cassandra Borges Bortolom, excuse me, Cassandra, for making a hash of that. It's going to be in Portuguese, and in fact, she did send me today or yesterday the Portuguese version of the title, but I didn't have time to put it onto the slide. So it's going to be in Portuguese, but it's going to be on motivational interviewing for family members, or a motivational intervention for family members living with a relative with a substance use disorder. And again, we will try to get simultaneous translation, but her talk will cover information about both research and clinical practice. And then finally, in the programme so far, we have Professor Anne Whitaker from the University of Stirling, and she's going to be talking about a particular variant of the Parents Under Pressure programme, which is a parenting intervention for children and families with a parent dependent on alcohol or drugs. And this particular variant of it, which is the PUP for Dads, is looking at the Parenting Under Pressure programme, which is focusing specifically on involving fathers who are on opioid substitution therapy in this parenting program. Fathers are very difficult to get involved, and males are generally difficult to get involved in this sort of work, and fathers are particularly difficult, often particularly fathers who are the relative with the drug problem. So it's going to be extremely interesting to hear about this intervention. People may be wondering why we have two presentations in Portuguese, two from Brazil. The reason is very simple. We have a lot of interest in AFINet from Brazil. I think Brazil is possibly the country with the second largest number of members, and that's because Cassandra and Ronaldo have been very, very good in recruiting other people who are interested in this area in their country. And also both of those people both Ronaldo and Cassandra are on our trustee board. And all of the people who are giving the presentations initially are trustees. That's not because we're limiting it to trustees, but simply they're the only ones I've asked so far. So I think that is the end of my presentation. So I will pass over to Gallus, who I hope will not tell me that nothing I've said has been recorded and nothing I've said has been heard, but I hope we'll now have some questions.
Yes, thank you very much. And as far as I can see, everything has been recorded. So, and to all people who have colleagues who are interested in seeing the presentation but couldn't attend today, this will be uploaded on a YouTube channel, and we will also announce this via the AFINet web page. But as a next step, there have already been first questions in the chat, and I think most of them have already also been answered. So I think at the moment it would be really interesting to see if any other comments or questions are up in our audience. So if you, I don't know if it's technically possible that participants just can ask questions by turning on their mics. Maybe Minna knows something about this.
Yes, I can shortly write a message to the message board that would like to raise a question, but Tuuli has prepared to pick up something from the chat, so maybe Tuuli can direct them to Richard.
Okay, so then I'll hand over to Tuuli at the moment.
Hello, hello from Finland. I have been reading these questions, and I think that it would be good to hear Richard's point of view on these, even though there has already been some answers. So there was one question, taking up in a group the AFINet process, that if you are not following the whole AFINet five-step program, so could you tell Richard about that? Is it, can you take only parts of the program into a group process that is going on?
Right. Thank you for that, Tuuli. Do you know who asked the question, or does that not matter? I can see later from the chat. I suppose my answer to that is yes and no. So obviously people can use the ideas in the five-step method in whatever way they wish. And the five-step method, each of the steps in the five-step method is is relatively clear. So if somebody were to read the handbook or read the criteria which we use for accreditation, they will see what is contained in that step. And if they only wanted to discuss coping, or they only want to discuss information needs, or they only want to discuss social support or whatever, then of course they could. And these things are not, although the actual words are copyrighted, the ideas of course are not copyrighted. So if somebody thought, well, I don't really like for whatever reason, the idea of doing the whole of the 5-step method in the group that I'm running, but I think it would be really useful to have a discussion about coping, well, of course they can. However, that's the yes bit of the answer. The no bit of the answer is, well, actually we have developed a method which fits with our model of the stress, strain, coping support, so that if you only do bits of it, the chances of reducing the amount of strain that any bit of stress is going to be providing, that the chances of that happening are less. And we organize the 5-step method in the way that we do. That is, we cover careful listening and trying to reassure and normalize in the first step, helping people with their information needs in the second step, so that we only get into coping at a time when people already know the practitioner or the person running the group quite well and feel safe. And I make that point because a lot of affected family members come in thinking that they're doing it wrong, thinking that they're going to be told that they're not coping in the right way, that they're making the situation worse, they're going to be blamed in some way. And our experience is, if you start talking about coping too quickly, people can misunderstand what you're saying in a way that's not particular. Whereas if you've already made a relationship with them and they do trust you, they can hear your questions about what did you actually do yesterday when he said that or when she did that. Now let's think about what were the advantages about how you responded to that were. There must have been some advantages because you wouldn't have responded in that way. What were those advantages? What you feel were the disadvantages? Did you feel anything went wrong when you responded in that way? Or how could you do something different? And if you did, what would be the advantage of that? And what would be the disadvantages of that? And we try and use our 3 main ways of coping to help people think, well, which way were they using when they did that yesterday or last week? What might it look like if they use another of these main ways of coping, and so on. So by the time we get into that with people, people have got to know the practitioner quite well. They feel they don't feel blamed, they feel supported, and so they can have a much more open discussion. So my feeling is, yes, of course you can use bits of the 5-step method in your individual counselling work or practitioner work or in your group sessions, but we would recommend using the whole of the 5-step method because it fits together very well.
There were 2 questions also coming after Janne. Or did Jill already answer one? One was anyway about, is it possible to train to 5-step method online? Are you planning on going online with the
Okay, well, I think Jill has already
training?
answered some of that in the chat, but I will chuck in as well, which is that Ireland are piloting doing online training at the moment, and we're eagerly awaiting the results of that online piloting. And if anybody wants more information about that, they can email Jill directly, and she's put her email address onto chat.
And did Alicia Ventura get an answer to her question about, can you elaborate on what providers have shared about their experiences working with AFMs?
Yes, of course. I mean, a lot depends on the nature of the providers. So there are some providers like the Family Support Network in Ireland, for example, or the organisation that I was mentioning earlier, Family Drug Support in Christchurch, New Zealand, who are set up specifically to work with affected family members. Basically, all the things that I've said about how affected family members are affected are reinforced by them or have come from research we've done with them about the effects on affected family members. So organisations that are set up to work with affected family members know how badly they are affected and have found the 5-step method to be extremely helpful for them in working out how best to help these family members. The other sorts of organisations are ones which are set up to provide services for people with problems because of their own use of alcohol or drugs or gambling. And their experience has been very interesting and I suppose slightly different. So if I take the example of the National Health Service gambling clinics, which are being set up in the north of England at the moment, were set up starting about a year ago, and then have had a lot of difficulty in the north of England because of COVID. But they took the decision early on that they wanted working with family members to be an integral part of what they were doing. And that's partly because they are associated with the existing National Health Service gambling clinic, problem gambling clinic, which is based in London, who also provide services for affected family members. And that's been an interesting learning curve for them, because the practitioners were coming in with a very clear focus on the person with the gambling problem, and helping them see beyond that and work with affected family members has, I think, been interesting for them. For some, it's probably been challenging. They've found that they're a lot more confident, for example, talking about how the person, talking with family members about how the person with the gambling problem might be able to access further help than they are with talking with the family member about how the family member might be able to access help. So it's interesting trying to help an organisation that is made up of practitioners who will have a history of ignoring affected family members, helping them move beyond that, and they're doing it excellently, and they've got some very good practitioners up there. But it's been, I think, that's been one of the challenges, and is one of the challenges for people who hitherto have only thought about the user and not the family.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I just want to ask a quick follow-up question. So I'm in the US and we have very strict laws around privacy, which prohibit the disclosure of any information to family members unless the patient is to sign specific consent allowing the provider to speak with the family member. So I'm wondering if you have any experience or have worked with any US providers that have shared information from that perspective.
Right. Okay. And hello, Alicia, should I say. It's very nice to hear your voice after exchanging emails with you.
Yeah, likewise.
So, again, a slightly complicated answer. The first thing is, in terms of the US, no, because as I think I said to you when I've emailed you, although we've had actually a lot of interest over the years from US therapists and organizations and providers, that has never gone anywhere. At the moment, I'm working with a couple of graduate students doing PhDs who are trying to implement the 5-step method as part of their theses. But in general, we have not had any strong take-up from US organizations of the 5-step method. And therefore, this is not an issue that's come up in the US. But of course, it's an issue that's come up in every other country. So it's not just the US that has these requirements about confidentiality and privacy. And I'd say two things about that. The first thing is that the vast majority of people with alcohol or drug or gambling problems never come into treatment, and therefore the vast majority of affected family members are not affected family members of people who are in treatment. They are affected family members of people who are not in treatment, and that makes their problems all the more worse and all the more severe. And it's those people in particular that need a lot of help. So when we're doing research, we try not to do research on the family members of people who are in treatment, because they are a very unusual group. And of course, most family members of people who are already in treatment are different because they have an element of hopefulness, which other family members don't have, because their loved one is actually in treatment and they think there might be a change to their alcohol or drug or gambling use. So the vast majority of people that we use the 5-step method with are not in that situation. The second thing is that there are many organisations in, certainly in the UK and in other countries, and I don't know how this would be in the States, who accept that family members are legitimate clients of their organisation, legitimate service users, and therefore a family member can come and be a service user. As it may be the case that their alcohol or drug or gambling relative can also come, is also coming, and is also being seen, but those two things would be completely separate. So there would be no sharing of any information, and almost certainly they would be being seen by completely different counsellors who would not be in the same supervision group. There would be a firewall between the information, because both of these are legitimate clients in their own right. In exactly the same way, I suppose, if a married couple go to see a primary care physician or go to a primary care practice and are each seen by a different practitioner, there would be no suggestion that the information about one would be shared with the information with the other person, and so on. So that firewall is, I think, something that most providers will be clear about. And then thirdly, there is also the situation where a person with alcohol or drug or gambling problems comes into a service and they are asked whether they would like their family to be involved in their treatment. Now that's a very a thing which happens, I think, all too rarely. But then, of course, if they say no, then that family's members are not involved in their treatment. But if they say yes, then of course they can be invited in, they can be used in lots of ways. And our feeling in general in AFINet is that it's very positive to involve the family, because obviously the family is living with the person with the alcohol or drug or gambling problem 24/7 most of the time. And you, when you're seeing somebody in an outpatient basis, may see them, if you and they are lucky, maybe for 50 minutes every week or every 2 weeks. So the amount of impact that family members can have, for either in a way which is particularly helpful for the counselling or could be quite damaging for the counselling, not because the family members wish it to be damaging, but if they don't know what's going on and they don't know what route is being selected by the practitioner who's working with their loved one, they may inadvertently be saying or doing things which are completely opposite to what the practitioner would be hoping the family would be doing. So our view is involving family members is almost always very helpful. The only question marks come over situations where there is evidence of interpersonal and domestic violence, and then one has to tread very carefully, because there are situations where if you involve the family member in the counselling, things might be said in those sessions which then could have very negative effects on the family member outside of the sessions. That's not a reason not to involve the family member, but it is something that needs to be thought through, both by the practitioner and the family member and the relative. There we are. I'm afraid, I'm afraid quite a long answer.
No, thank you. That's super helpful and wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
There has been questions also from Therese Collins, and I think that we could take this first question now, and maybe she likes to add something, but there was this question about how do you help the family member to avoid self-stigma?
A very good question, Therese, and lovely that you've managed to join us. And maybe at some point when I finish, you can unmute, or even you could unmute now, and if you want to add anything to that question.
So as you know from our email conversations, I am looking at trying to perform my research here in the United States with the self-help handbook. But where I live in semi-rural America, self-stigma and the words that we don't use here with the 5-step method, the coping and the codependency and enabling, which is so has such a negative connotation. So I guess my concern is if I'm not there to help them as they work through the steps, because it's a self-help handbook, how do I help them avoid self-stigma and applying the culture of America on themselves instead of embracing the philosophy of the 5-step method?
It's a very, very good question. And hello, by the way, it's really nice to hear your voice after our email conversation. Yes, very nice. It's a very good question, and I'm not sure that I've got a very good answer. Although my colleagues may also come in here as well if they want to add to what I'm going to say. I think it's terribly difficult. Not just the whole self-stigma is particularly bad, but also, as you say, the model, which is very prevalent in the US in particular, but in other countries as well, of as we see it, really saying that the family is part of the problem, and it's all about codependency and not coping in the right ways, and all of these things are very, very blaming of family members. And obviously, if you come from a culture where that is what happens, how your own understanding of the role that family members play is formed by the culture in which you live, and therefore it's not surprising that people stigmatize themselves because that's the model that they've been offered. So yes, here in AFINet we are trying to offer a very different model, which says families are part of the solution on the one hand, and families need help in their own right on the other hand, and they're not necessarily part of the problem. I mean, that's not to say that people never have what might be called toxic families. Of course, sometimes that happens, but that, in our experience, is very much the exception as opposed to the rule. In the main, we see family members caught up in an awful situation for themselves, where they were, in a sense, quietly going about their own lives, and suddenly they discover that somebody in the family, it could be one of their children, it could be their partner, it could be their parent, has got a very serious problem with alcohol or drugs or gambling, which appears at certain of the family member to be very disadvantageous to the family, to the individual family member and to the rest of the family, and yet they don't seem to be able to do anything about it, and the relative doesn't appear to be able to do anything about it, or even often doesn't appear to want to do anything about it. So the model that you have of understanding that, which says actually this is your fault, is not one that we adopt within AFINet. It's not one that we're happy with. How you change those people, though, when what you're planning on doing is basically giving them access to a self-help handbook, is very tricky, because obviously there's no knowing what people will make of it, and some people may read it and say, well, this doesn't apply to us. Family, there's nothing in here about codependency. It's not going to be any use to me. And I suppose that's part of what your research questions have to be. If you're working in an environment where family members are schooled to think quite negatively about themselves, and you offer them a way of helping themselves which uses a different model, is that something which family members can actually take up? I'm sure you'll find some can and some can't, and the important question is how many can, and what are the ways that they use to be able to take up this new model, a new way of thinking, and why did the people who rejected it reject it. So those would be very interesting research questions. I don't know if that's any help at all.
No, it is. And as I was reflecting on the method, I was thinking that mindfulness is very much sort of an element, because what happened in the immediate past that led to the addiction, it's in the past. Mm-hmm. We need to be focused on the here and now, and where are you now, and how can we help you move forward now? You know, it's like you can't cry over the spilt milk. Let's move forward.
Absolutely, and the 5-step method is extremely future focused, and although we invented it before mindfulness became at all popular, and maybe even before as a term it was invented, or obviously it goes back to Buddhist philosophy, which certainly predates even our 40 work in this area. We do use a lot of mindfulness techniques. We try and get people to think very much about the here and now. And we go, if we're talking about coping, we never, for example, say, how do you generally cope with things? What we say is, when was the last time something like this happened? Did it happen yesterday or the day before? Some incident that they've told us about. And then we go into that in a very mindful way. Can you describe exactly what happened? You know, so yes, you walked through the front door, and where was your partner standing, and where were you standing? What happened then? Who said the first thing? What did they say? So we do very, very detailed work to try and get people to think incredibly carefully about what they did, to reconstruct that so that they can think at any stage in that chain of events, I could have done something different. Obviously, my loved one could have done something different as well, but I'm not in charge of my loved one. I can't do that, but I can think about how I might change. And if I did something different, what might be the effect of that? I don't know, but maybe next time I might try and do something different in that situation, and then see whether the outcome is better or worse. So it's getting people to think in this very mindful way.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
I think I'll just have to step in briefly since we have to watch the time. If I understood everything correctly, there was one question at least which hasn't been answered yet, which was Callista. She asked, how was your experience in family with fatherless parenting regarding the 5-step method?
I need a bit more information. I don't quite understand that question.
I don't know if Callista just could unmute her mic. Maybe it's something, are there specific elements when just a single mother is conducting 5-step?
Well, I suppose a lot depends on whether this single mother is it depends on the relationship between her and the relative with the alcohol or drug or gambling problem. That's what I'm trying to gather. So are we talking about a single mother who's a parent of a child who's got an alcohol or drug or gambling problem, an adult child, adolescent or adult child? Are we talking about a single mother who's got grandchildren and her partner used to have an alcohol or drug problem, or her partner does have an alcohol drug problem, but they're not living together anymore? So it depends on the nature of the relationship. But other than that, no, we've often worked with single parents. If we're talking about somebody who's a parent of an offspring who's got an alcohol or drug or gambling problem, very often we only work with one parent anyway, the other one doesn't come. So whether there is a second parent at home or whether there isn't a second parent at home, we've found the 5-step method to be an effective way of working with parents, one or both parents, about how to get a better sense of control over their lives if they've got a drug or alcohol or gambling misusing son or daughter.
Well, Callista just explained that the question was rather that there is a father, but parenting is just in the domestic area only something which is done by the mother. This is what she meant by fatherless parenting. But I think it's a rather complex issue.
And it may well be that you need to come to the webinar that Anne's going to do in 3 or 4 months' time, because that was all about getting fathers involved in an intervention. But I mean, it seems to me that if you've got a situation where one of the parents is basically absolving himself of any responsibility and putting all the responsibility onto the other parent to try and deal with the problem amongst of the children, then that's part of what you will be drawing out in steps 1, and you'll be looking at what the information needs are associated with that situation in step 2. And in step 3, you're going to be doing a lot of stuff about how you cope with not only the misusing child, but also with a partner who is saying, I don't really want to have anything to do with this, even though they obviously have got something to do with it because they are living within the same family. And again, that would come up a lot in step 4 under sources of support, because that it sounds under those circumstances as if the mother would be actually feeling very unsupported by her husband or her partner at that time, at a time when she actually needs most support. So one of the things we might be talking about in step 4 is how can you engage your partner more so that your partner is more supportive of you in trying to deal with your child's alcohol or drug or gambling problem. That was a very speedy answer. See, I can do speed sometimes because I know it's 15:27 and we need to have a little break before the AGM.
Great. There was just one other issue, a remark, I think more that from Jan, that also in future discussions she'd like to learn more about the possibilities and limitations of using 5-step in online help groups, which I think is really interesting, and I'm quite sure there will be also future work on that. But I fully agree with Richard that we should have a very short break before we go to the AGM. And to all non-AFINet members who have joined us for the webinar, I just would recommend to you to become AFINet members, which is free. And if you have watched the chat, you've seen there's been quite a lot of networking and also questions regarding resources. And many of these are available in the member section of the AFINet web page. So, like I said, I really encourage you to become members. And now my last questions before I'd suggest to have a 5 minutes break goes to Thule, whether I forgot something according to everything you've been also supervising on the chat.
I think you did a very good job, Carlos, and I think everything, all the main questions have been answered. I would really just recommend people to use the AFINet web pages and also sending links in different languages, because it doesn't have to be only English that we use. So if you are working, for example, in Spanish, as there was that links shared from Mexico, and so it's important that we share also other kind of materials. So that came up in the conference, and I think it's very important. Thank you.
Great. And maybe for all of you who have been afraid after Richard's talk that the next 3 webinars won't be in English, at least I am planning to have my talk in English, and we are also planning to have simultaneous translation for the Portuguese talks. So I'm sure even if you're an English native speaker, you'll be able to follow, but we'll keep you updated. And I'd suggest that we also email the dates of the next webinars to everyone who is not yet an AFINet member but has been attending today.